If you were to say that you were looking to get a Nirvana-inspired pedal setup, there are a few different distortion pedals people would point you to. You'd most likely get recommendations to get one of these three. They are what Kurt Cobain used the most live, either the Boss DS1, DS2, or the Sans Amp. Some might even throw in the Rat or the Big Muff because of how Kurt used those in the studio. But what I believe is more universally accepted is which companion pedal best completes a Nirvana-inspired setup to go along with any of those pedals, and that would be the Electro-Harmonix small clone. The pedal that is responsible for the lush, watery chorus sounds that are a signature part of many of Nevermind's biggest and most iconic songs. A pedal that Kurt is first seen with in early 1991, and then it never leaves his feet after that. In this episode of the Nirvana Pedal History Series, we'll be looking into the history of this famous pedal, discussing the release and all the variations of it, breaking down Kurt's use of it, and then comparing 3 different small clone units to see what the differences are. A vintage 80s unit from the very first run, a 90s reissue, and a modern reissue from the 2010s. So when you look at a small clone, you'll notice right away that function-wise, it's a pretty simple and straightforward pedal. There's only 2 functions on it, the depth switch and the rate knob. So while the functions of this pedal are pretty simple, its history release and all the variations get a little more complicated. The first original run was manufactured from 1979 to 1983. And there are a few different giveaways to know if you're looking at a vintage pedal from the original run or a later reissue. The original vintage units have a clear and smaller LED light versus the red and larger LED in later reissues. Originals don't have a dash mark between full and chorus, but the reissues do. There's a long-running rumor that the earliest original ones produced are the ones that say mini chorus on them, but this hasn't been proven or debunked. The truth is that vintage units that say mini or full on them have the same circuit and the same components. They are essentially the same pedal from the same run. Vintage units such as this one will either have the MN3007 chip or the Reticon SAD1024 chip. The Reticon is the rare and more sought out of the two, and there are subtle sound differences between these two chips. Just from reading from people who have compared both, the Reticon chip sounds more watery and adds a slight boost to the signal, whereas the MN3007 allows higher levels and less noise without clipping. But in conclusion, neither version is better or worse, it just comes down to personal preference. And apparently, there is no rhyme or reason as to which vintage units have which chip. Some just have the Reticon, and some just have the MN, and they were produced in the same time period. When it comes to the reissues, there isn't a lot of information out there about which chip is in them. Most places say that all the reissues have the MN3007 chip, which would technically be the same chip that some of the vintage units have. But apparently, there's differences between these chips too. That a vintage MN chip sounds different than the reissue chips you find in small clones today. The original MN chip is said to sound more subtle, where the newer ones in the reissues have a more pronounced effect. The first time we see Kurt with a small clone is on January 18th, 1991, at the No More Wars benefit show at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. After this show, this pedal would never leave his setup. Rick King, who is the owner of the music store Guitar Maniacs in Tacoma, recalls that Kurt purchased 5 units. I really love this little anecdote because if you look at the context of what kind of band Nirvana was at the time, before Nevermind, during Bleach, and even pre-Bleach, you have to objectively say that a chorus pedal like this seems kind of out of character for Kurt to add into his rig. It'd be so interesting to know if he was trying to emulate something specific, or if he wanted to just add something new out of the blue. Either way, regardless of the reasoning, it's obvious that Kurt really liked this pedal if the owner remembers him coming in and buying 5 of them. There's a really vague story I read years ago, and I've looked and I can't find a source for it, so please don't quote me. But I remember reading some sort of story about someone in Kurt's circle seeing him with this pedal and saying, "What are you doing with that? Why do you have a chorus pedal?" And Kurt's response was something along the lines of, "Just you wait and see these new songs I've been writing." I don't want to be quoted on that could be completely bogus, but I swear I remember reading a story like that somewhere. It's been commonly believed that the small clones that Kurt used had the Reticon chip, but his guitar tech Earnie Bailey has actually said that it's possible that his had both, the Reticon and the MN chip. And at the end of the day, Kurt had so many of these units that completely makes sense that he had both. I think a large part as to why the Reticon chip is so sought after is because it has this reputation of being the Kurt Cobain small clone chip, but in reality, a vintage unit with either chip is the Kurt Cobain small clone pedal. Earnie also recalls hardwiring the depth switch to the deep setting on at least 2 of Kurt's units. He mentions that this was done out of reliability and that these knobs are easily damaged. The small clone is most famous for and will always be tied to Nevermind, specifically for its uses in 2 of its biggest songs, Smells Like Teen Spirit and Come As You Are, but we can also hear it in Bloom and Drain You. A lot of people look at this pedal as like the Come As You Are pedal. Electro-Harmonix themselves have even leaned into that. But as I discussed in my Come As You Are tone recreation video, that iconic sound is actually more than just this pedal on its own. Kurt did track his guitars with this pedal, but you have to keep in mind that Andy Wallace used the Yamaha SPX90 when mixing the album, and he used that to add even more chorus and more depth to the guitars. So therefore, because of that, a small clone alone will never 100% get you that Come As You Are sound. It doesn't matter which chip is in it, which amp you have, which speakers in your amp. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but it's just how audio production works. There was more chorus added in post. I know that's probably a big bummer to some, but if you think about it, Kurt himself never replicated that sound 100% live. Studio magic like that is commonplace when mixing albums to make it sound bigger and more lush. And not everything that's always done in the studio can be replicated live. And that's okay. I think it's cool that there's a specific Come As You Are studio sound, and there are also different Come As You Are live sounds depending on how Kurt set his pedal, because he set it differently depending on the era. So while he always used this pedal for the songs previously mentioned when playing them live, in the Nevermind era he also occasionally used it for solos, such as Rate Me live at the Paramount, and more consistently, but not always, during this era, he would use it for the Blue solo and Aneurysm during the Ascending Notes. The original Nevermind unit that Kurt used is believed to have been stolen after the Jabberjosh show. That show took place the day after the sessions ended. It's believed that it was stolen along with the K-Strat and the Mosrite Gospel. As I just mentioned, Kurt's settings vary from era to era. In the Nevermind era, the setting was strong and very pronounced, whereas during the In Utero tour, Kurt dialed it back a little bit and the chorus is a lot more subtle. You'll now be hearing me demo 3 different small clones from 3 different time periods. The 80s vintage unit that I'm using was sent out to me by my good friend John to borrow to use for this video. So John, again, I cannot thank you enough for your generosity and your trust and for allowing me to create this video with your amazing pedal. Not only is this a vintage small clone, which already makes it really special, John actually bought this from Guitar Maniacs in Tacoma, the same exact store that Kurt bought his small clones at. I honestly get goosebumps thinking about that, and if you ask me, it does not get much more Nirvana than that. The only way it can get more Nirvana is if you were to play Kurt's actual pedal. We'll be comparing this original unit to my 2 small clones. There is my 90s reissue, and this one was actually my very first pedal that I ever bought. It stopped working after a few years, so I replaced it with this modern reissue, which was probably made in like either 2014 or 15. Many years later, once I knew a little bit more about electronics and I felt comfortable enough, I opened up my original 90s small clone, and thankfully I was able to fix it. I had no idea what I was doing, but it works now. And when I use a small clone in my videos, this is the one you're hearing, my original 90s one, because the difference between this and the modern reissue is really subtle, but this one just gets that much closer to Kurt's sound. All 3 of these small clones have the MN3007 chips. So you would think they would all sound similar, but there are differences between the 3. Between the 2 reissues, the differences are very subtle. They sound basically identical until you start to push them harder into like the Paramount area. I can hear a difference there, but even then it's still subtle. But John's original pedal is on a planet of its own. It sounds like a completely different pedal compared to the other 2. There's a huge difference, especially in the depth switch sound differences. When I'm playing the original versus the reissues, it's kind of crazy how different I need to set the reissues to get a similar sound to what I'm getting out of the original. Because this run is what Kurt used, so I believe that the settings on here are more true to what Kurt's settings were as opposed to what you put on the reissues. So there will be two parts to the demo. I'm going to open up with a more traditional demo where I'll be playing clean chords on the same settings on all three pedals just so you can hear the differences even when they're set exactly the same. After that will come the more Nirvana specific demo. I will be attempting to recreate the chorus sound from 3 separate Nirvana shows from 2 different eras. For each show, I'll be using era specific guitars and settings. And for each show, you will hear the samples clean and also with the distortion pedal that Kurt was using at that show. The settings that you will see on these 3 pedals are the closest that I could get them to sounding like these shows. So let me know what you think. If you're currently shopping around for a small clone, did this sway you any way to search for a specific run, like specifically to spend the big bucks on a vintage pedal? Or did this sway you the other way, that the reissues do the job just as well? I would love to know what you think and your preference between these 3 pedals. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.